Greetings and welcome to the fifth video in this series on dialectical thinking. In the previous video, we learned specific ways to become more aware and more accepting of problem thoughts. In this video, we will learn a simple strategy to change those thoughts by working the TOM. So let's get started. Okay, so once we have helped clients become more aware and more accepting of their thoughts, sometimes we need to help them actively change those thoughts. So if you remember from the previous video, the awareness and the acceptance alone are change. Those are examples of change. And not only that, they create change, right? Just acceptance and awareness can cause major shifts in thinking. But sometimes that's not enough. Sometimes once we become more aware and accepting of our thoughts, we realize that we need to do something to actively change those thoughts. Well, when that's the case, TOM is a simple acronym which stands for thought, opposite, and middle. So that's how we help our clients change problematic thoughts. First, help the client identify an ineffective thought that they're having. Next, help the client identify the exact opposite of that thought. And finally, help the client identify a thought that is somewhere more in the middle. So that's the basic sequence here. Thought, opposite, middle. So let's talk about those steps in a little more detail. So the first step is helping the client identify a problematic or distorted thought, such as, I am so overweight. I look so disgusting. So what's the next step? If we were doing CBT, cognitive behavioral therapy, the next step would be to challenge, refute, dispute, point out how that's illogical, there's no evidence, etc. We're not going to do that in DBT. In DBT, the next step is have the clients identify the opposite extreme of that thought. And you want to make the opposite extreme as silly or as exaggerated, as irrational, or even comical as possible. For example, I am the epitome of thinness. The Barbie doll was designed for my personal replica. I am clearly Miss Universe. In fact, if there was another universe, I would be Miss Universe there too. Right? And there's a couple of reasons you want to just exaggerate, embellish the opposite extreme as much as possible. One is so that you have ample distance between the original thought and the opposite extreme, so that you have plenty of middle ground to work with when we get to the middle thought. But there's another reason that you want to exaggerate that opposite extreme. And that is, the more you exaggerate, the more you embellish the opposite extreme, the more the client is going to recognize what you're doing. And they're going to realize just how irrational that opposite extreme is. And that's important because clients are often doing that same process to the original thought, but not recognizing it. So more often than not, that original problem thought is grounded in some grain of truth, but the client has taken that grain of truth and just run with it. And they've embellished it more and more and more, but they haven't recognized that they've done that. But when you do that same process to the opposite extreme, they pick up on that. And so therefore, you can kind of use that as an opportunity to foster some insight in your client. And you can maybe even ask them, oh, so you were really good at noticing that I was exaggerating the opposite thought. So I'm just curious, do you think maybe you've done that to the original thought? But be that as it may, the next step, once you've identified the two extremes, is to help the clients identify a more balanced middle thought. What's something in between those two extremes? And so, example, that might be, well, maybe I am still a tad pleasantly plump, but I am also really proud of all the weight I've lost so far, right? So you want to make sure that middle thought is believable to the client. Okay, so that's the process. Thought, opposite, middle. But I just want to make a few more points about this process. So one point is there is no single correct middle thought. Remember, the whole idea here is to be dialectical and to think about things from different perspectives. So it's perfectly possible and maybe even advisable to have multiple middle thoughts. Another point to keep in mind here is that having the middle thought does not instantly or automatically cancel out the original thought. However, at the very least, the original thought now has some competition. Another point I want to reiterate here is notice we have just helped a client plant a new thought in their minds without confronting, correcting, challenging, refuting, disputing the original thought. And we did this simply by identifying the original thought, identifying the opposite extreme, and identifying something more in the middle. That's all we did. And another point I want you to keep in mind is that the client's middle thought is not always going to be as close to dead center as you would like. That's okay. Because remember, any middle thought the client comes up with is already dialectical, since it is a different perspective than the original thought. Remember, the whole point of this exercise is to help the client become more dialectical, not necessarily to think and believe everything that you think and believe, or not everything that you think the client should think and believe. Simply to introduce another perspective here. Which brings me to the last point, and that is it's really important that eventually clients can come up with the middle thought on their own, since those words came from their own head and therefore will be more believable than any middle thought that you suggest. Now, granted, you might be working with some clients that literally at first cannot come up with their own middle thought. Why? Because they're just brand new to this whole idea of dialectics. So at first, you might have to coach them and you might have to make suggestions for middle thoughts if they can't come up with any on their own. But eventually, you want clients to get to the point where they are doing this on their own, because whatever they come up with is going to be much more believable. And no surprise, because those thoughts came from their head, not yours. Okay, so let's summarize a few of the key points that we covered in this video. So point number 1. Once we have helped clients become more aware and more accepting of their thoughts, sometimes we need to help them actively change those thoughts. TOM is a simple acronym which stands for thought, opposite, middle. First, help the client identify an ineffective thought. Next, help the client identify the exact opposite of that thought. And finally, help the client identify a thought that is somewhere more in the middle between those two extremes. Point number 2. This intervention helps clients plant a new thought in their minds without confronting, correcting, challenging, refuting, disputing the original thought. Introducing the middle thought does not instantly or automatically cancel out the original thought. However, at the very least, the original thought now has some competition. Any middle thought the client comes up with is already dialectical, since it is a different perspective from the original thought. And point number 3. It is really important that eventually clients come up with the middle thought on their own, since those words came from their own head and will therefore be more believable than any middle thoughts that you suggest.